Hey, Dad.
What?
What do you call a frog that's illegally parked?
I don't know what.
Toad.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Engage, a family gaming podcast. This is episode 144, and I'm your host, Stephen Duetzmann. As always, this is the official video game and board game podcast for EngagedFamilyGaming.com. EFG is a website where parents like myself and my co-hosts come together to give parents and families the information they need to get their family game on. This week is another special week. You'll notice last week we talked about board games. Specifically, we talked about all the games that I played at the Connecticut Festival of Independent Games. But we're doing board games 2 weeks in a row. So the video game folks, you'll be patient. We'll get there. But I have a special guest, Mr. Steve Jackson of Steve Jackson Games. How are you, sir?
I'm hanging in there. It's warm in Texas, but we'll get by.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it always warm in Texas? I have never been there.
We get snow maybe 1 year in 3, but the winters are plenty cold enough for me.
Oh, all right.
I am much better in warm weather than cold weather, so I live here where it's much likelier to be warm than cold. So I can't complain, but I do.
The math checks out on that. So, you live where you want. My dad, I don't talk about him too much on the show just because, whatever, but he loves Texas. And if you saw a picture of him, you would know. But he looks like a guy who loves Texas, but is not from Texas. So he walks around in the cowboy boots and the hat and all that, and he lives in Connecticut. So he looks a little out of place. I think his plan is to try and winter there because he does not like the cold. And I can't really blame him. I'm going to follow him just because I hear the food's all right.
Get barbecue.
Yeah, but I mean that's what I read about. So before we get too much farther, I do want to take a moment to thank our listeners for listening this week. We hope the games you've been playing have been great. I know Steve and I have some exciting stuff to talk about. We do want to make our podcast more interactive, so please feel free to reach out on social media or message us on our Facebook page with any comments, questions, topic suggestions, etc. As many of you already know, we do alternate topics between video games and board games, but I go where the business takes us. And this time, we have a really cool Kickstarter from Steve Jackson Games called The Fantasy Trip. And I wanted to get Steve on here so we could talk about it for 2 reasons. One, I wanted to talk to you and have wanted to for quite some time just about the games that you make in general, but also because this is a really cool project because this is one of the first tabletop role-playing games that you made. You lost the rights to it, and now you got them back. Tell me, what's this process been like?
Oh, which process? The getting the rights back?
Well, the getting the rights back probably can't talk too much about that, but I would like to hear let's start in the beginning. I guess is the best place. So the Fantasy Trip, I did my homework on this. So this is, late 70s. Right? If I'm remembering this correctly?
77. You're
77. Right. And which is why I missed it. And so this is one of that early generation. I read somewhere that you felt that once the game kind of got built, you really thought that it was a good idea to kind of spin it up and make it a little bit bigger because you thought that it could actually compete with Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, we started off with Melee, which is just the little combat game.
Sure.
And that was originally created because as a D&D player, I wanted more detail in my combat.
Sure.
And there weren't any modules for that, so I wrote my own.
Sure.
And it was popular, so we did a sequel, kind of the flip side of the coin, called Wizard, which was the magic combat game. And feedback was still good, so I started writing regular role-playing rules.
Fair enough. So you were a Dungeons and Dragons player, as was most everybody kind of in our corner of the hobby at that time, right? Because it was kind of blowing up towards the late 70s and early 80s. Tell me what. Because this is something that's a complete blind spot for me. What was combat in the original Dungeons and Dragons like, and what was missing that you wanted to kind of improve on?
position was missing. If you're in a room with 4 party members and 3 orcs, there wasn't really any way to tell where you were. It was just
you just kind of did stuff.
I strike at the orc, and the dungeon master would either allow it or not, and usually he'd allow it because that was what we were there for, was to strike at orcs.
Sure. So you create, so essentially Melee, and I'm looking at the videos, and anyone that is listening, don't, if you're driving, but when you get a moment, head on over to Kickstarter and look up The Fantasy Trip. That's the name of the game we're talking about. And you'll see, so this used a hex-based movement system. So you had, chits on the board, moving guys around. So this kind of gave you that sense of tactics and movement.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's a very tactical game. It moves quickly, but it really matters where you are, and you don't want to let somebody get behind you.
Absolutely. What's interesting, people who play like 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons or even 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons, like they take, myself for example, or you take that miniatures and like movement system out, and it's almost like you take it for granted, right? Like the fact that there were games back in the early parts of history that didn't have that piece.
State of the art has improved a lot.
Yeah, well, I mean, they stand on the shoulders of giants, as they say. So, as one of those, I mean, it's super neat to look at some of the art and some of the work that was done. I have not played it, but I can't wait to. So we all know that people lose the rights to things, because that's just how board games worked back in the day. What made you want to go get the rights back?
That's a hard question. Why would I not want to get the rights back?
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, sometimes you pitch easy questions,
The game had been out of print for decades because the publisher went out of business.
Okay.
And I really wanted to see it out there again.
Okay. That's a more than reasonable answer. And so now that you got it back and it's on Kickstarter, and obviously, we talked about this before we hit the record button. This is obviously not going to be a problem for funding. We're 3 days into the project and you're already, 6 times plus your original funding goal, which is awesome. So, I mean, basically it's a pre-order at this point. How exciting has that been to kind of see the process from, getting the rights back to kind of building the new product and getting it out there?
Oh, it's been an awesome experience, and of course it's been very intense since the Kickstarter started.
Sure. Because
now I'm getting this fire hose of good feedback about what people want to see in the game.
Sure. Like what kind of, anything cool that you can share?
Well, they wanted the map X's to be bigger.
Okay.
And at first we said no, but our CEO, Phil, figured out that, we could do that.
Okay.
People were asking for a hardback version of the game book. We're going to do that.
Okay.
I think those are the big places there where we've already varied from our plan. But we have run a Kickstarter before that got absolutely out of control, and we're determined not to let that happen to this one.
Okay. So what do you mean by a Kickstarter that got out of control?
The first Kickstarter we ever did was for my game Ogre, which is a war game about a giant tank, and it came close to $1 million. There was so much enthusiasm and so many good ideas that we overpromised, and we still have 2 promises left to deliver on that one. We're not far from both of them, but I'm not going to let us get set up again, and Phil is certainly not going to let us set up for anything that takes that long to fulfill. Sometimes you just have to say no rather than sure, we can do that.
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah, we can do that, but it takes too long.
Yeah, sure. And also, I think at this point, people are, at this point, especially with the fantasy trip, you're not necessarily making a single boxed product. I mean, you're really not necessarily limited to the initial retail release of Melee and Wizard. You could, expand on it. People are kind of used to that, games as like a platform of.
I'm hoping that this is just the beginning of a role-playing line.
Sure.
We'll just have to see how success holds up.
Well,
I have my hopes.
Sure. Well, Steve Jackson Games is not necessarily a stranger to making a product and expanding on it ad infinitum. I mean, you guys do have Munchkin.
We certainly do.
Which leads me to, one of the first fan questions that I have, because I did reach out to some members of my community and tell them, with great excitement that I was going to be talking to you, and, ask them to, shoot me some questions. And one of them is actually about Munchkin. And I know this is kind of like off the beaten path, but they did want me to ask, with that game being so infinitely expandable, because people keep making IP and you keep kind of moving into different territories. We're speaking specifically about Magic School, which just came out, which everybody that I am around loves, by the way. Do you feel like that's a well that will ever run dry?
10 years ago, I was worried that we might run out of Munchkin subjects. Now I'm not worried anymore.
You think, all right. You know what? I think that's a good answer, and an answer I certainly agree with. The more I thought about it, because they asked me that question, I was like, man, this seems kind of silly. Of course and now it's like, no, because people are just going to keep coming up with stuff. And then it's kind of like Weird Al's never going to run out of songs to parody, because people just keep making new music.
That's right.
So, I mean, you just follow that angle. I mean, and by the way, again, I can't repeat it enough. Magic School is really cool. A nice little project to parody. So anyway, that was one of our fan questions. I didn't want to forget that. So let's talk a little bit more about the fantasy trip. Why is it called the fantasy trip?
I can't remember. How's that for a straight answer?
Hey, listen, I love it when you're a Texas guy shooting straight with me. It certainly is going to hold itself, and I'm sure everybody's going to have their own stories on why it's called that way. Now, this isn't the only role-playing game that you guys as a company have, because you also have GURPS,
That's right.
So tell me.
I can tell you how we got the name GURPS, and it's even a worse story than I don't remember.
All right, I'm super excited to hear a story, because first of all, I don't think I want to be clear. I don't think I don't remember is a bad story. It's just, because it was a long time ago, and you've done a few things since then. So tell me about GURPS.
It's just kind of a short story, but
sure.
The GURPS name, well, for a long time we just had no title for it at all, and we published a playtest version of it with Great Unnamed Role-Playing System on the cover, which of course spells out to GURPS. And everybody who saw it just referred to it as GURPS, and we finally backronymed it and decided what GURPS could stand for, which was Generic Universal Role-Playing System.
Sure.
But it really stood for the Great Unnamed Role-Playing System, because all the good names were taken.
I think that's really
Not to
good.
mention some of the bad ones.
Yes. Oh man, yes. So when you say like the great, the generic, like universal, I mean, really it is. I have played it a handful of times, wildly different groups of people, wildly different settings. You really created that rule setup really to be universal. It's like a plug and play rule system. Hey, you want to make this thing that does this stuff? You can use GURPS or some version of it and accomplish what you need, right?
That's the plan.
Which is super neat. It's very elegant, and that's one of the things that I always thought, reading about GURPS or, encountering some of the books, being at conventions, the fact that if you know in general what you're doing, you can just kind of plop into any game. It doesn't matter if it's steampunk or sword and sorcery or zombies or whatever, and you just kind of get in and you just figure it out, and it's not that hard to participate, which I really love. So you have this established GURPS series that you have new products coming on pretty almost, I mean, not constantly, but pretty regularly. What's going to set the fantasy trip apart from GURPS? You know, 'cause
it's a much easier to get into game. It's faster to learn. It's faster to play. It's much more of an introductory system.
Oh, okay.
If you want detail and if you want the ability to take it into any sort of background, you're going to go for GURPS, and that's fine. But if you want the classic fantasy tropes, and if you want something, especially if you're teaching new people, then Fantasy Trip is a great place to start with. And some people find that that's a great place to stay, too.
Sure. Great. And I'm sure, you know, assuming this is successful, which, let's knock on wood, we hope it is, and it looks like it's doing okay. This is one of those things that you could kind of maybe even kind of bolt on more complicated stuff as time goes on, if people really do kind of want to hang out with
We could, but I don't really want to make it more complicated. I want to point them at GURPS if they want it more complicated. And try to go broad rather than deep on the support for the fantasy trip.
I like that. And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, considering, you heard the line at the front of the podcast, you know, we are all about families playing games together. And there is a special place in our heart for kind of introductory games, for game systems that encourage, you know, that whole broad as opposed to deep concept. You know, let's get everybody in here. Let's lower the barriers for entry. I'm 100% in on that. So that makes sense. I mean, and I guess it makes sense from a business perspective too, because if you took the fantasy trip and just made it more complex, then to a degree you'd be eating your own lunch, and why would you want to do that?
No.
That makes total sense. Total sense. So, there was a business need back in the day why Melee and Wizard were two separate products back in the late 70s, and that's because you made Melee first and then Wizard was kind of an expansion. Is there a reason specifically why you wanted to keep them separate now as opposed to, you know, just putting them in one box? Because technically you can buy them separately.
There might be about 3 reasons for that, and we did talk about combining them and just calling it Melee/Wizard, which everybody would have recognized, and there you go. But it gets back to the learning thing. It was just more of a quick start package if you're either just going for the tactical hand weapons combat or if you're just going for the magic.
Okay.
The rule sets are basically the same. Okay. If you crammed them together, you could save some trees, but then the whole thing would be that much longer.
Sure. Okay. No, that makes sense. So the Kickstarter itself offers, since we're, you know, talking about what the product is, the Kickstarter, you know, so there's a pledge where it's, you know, Melee and Wizard, you know, it's $30 and you get, looks like both of the base games, but it looks like the Legacy Edition is the next step up, and that includes, it looks like that package is still evolving, kind of depending on how things go, right?
Yeah, the Legacy Edition is a much better deal in terms of bang for your buck.
Sure, okay, because that's $60.
We're still adding to that one.
Oh, yeah, and it looks like that's the one that's going to be, like it said, it actually says it in the campaign, that one's still kind of evolving. Like, the video wasn't super detailed as far as what's going to be in the box, because we don't know yet. But at the very least,
it's going to make a supplementary video or something.
Sure.
I'm sorry, I talked over you. What did you say?
No, I was just going to say, just for sake of information, and I want everybody to go to the Kickstarter campaign anyway. But for sake of information, the way that it works is the Legacy Edition comes in a nice box, which I do love the cover art for, by the way. It includes both Melee and Wizards in their boxes, and then it comes with, it looks like 2. Are they adventures? The In the Labyrinth and Tolankar's Lair.
Tolankar's Lair is an adventure. Okay. In the Labyrinth is the book of role-playing rules.
Oh, you know what? That's right. And
then now it's going to include 2 solo adventures as well.
Oh, awesome.
Death Test and Death Test 2.
Okay.
Which are purely hack and slash.
Okay. And they're solo adventures, so they're one that I would sit down and just kind of like a game book, just I would play it myself.
Yes, although you can also take a group through it and act as the referee.
Oh, that's awesome.
You read the book and you tell them what they see.
Okay. That's super rad. And you know what? I can absolutely imagine, there are some game groups that's just all they want, like let's strip out the role play stuff. Let's just fight with no pretense. I know plenty of game groups that are into that. And so that would be that. My kids actually, they run my wife used to run a home daycare, and the older kids would, they would love to find these dudes on a map games and play and just kind of create scenarios. Feels like that's a thing that they would definitely enjoy. So, excuse me, I don't mean to cough at you.
I'm probably not going to get anything over Skype.
Probably not. I read somewhere that it's not likely to transfer, but I still like to apologize because I feel bad. So
fair enough.
So I was listening. So part of the Kickstarter videos, you got interviewed by Bebo, who is lovely. She's awesome. I love her new site. And you actually worked with, you got one of the original artists from the game to come back.
Yes, Elizabeth Danforth, Liz Danforth,
which
is best known as a magic artist. But back in the day, she did the first cover for the first edition of Melee. She did all the counters for Melee.
Yep.
And I convinced her to come back and do more Melee illustrations and to do all the counters.
That's awesome. That must have been a great kind of experience just for you, working with her back then and now working with her again.
Yes. It gives a great feeling of continuity.
Absolutely, which I think, as bringing back a legacy product like this, and I think that's probably an appropriate term for it, like bringing back something cool. I think it probably wouldn't, even to me, having never really experienced the first one, it still would have felt a little odd if you had to find somebody else. And I mean, you would have if you had to. I mean, you can't put it out without art. But I think there is something special about bringing back the original people who put it together and kind of putting it together again. And I mean, it's great that she found time. I mean, as you said, she makes magic card art, and I'm sure that they keep her busy because, man, do they not stop making cards.
We also have another member of the old team on the project, Guy McLemore, who was the line editor at Metagaming after I left, has come on board as line editor for the fantasy trip with us.
Awesome. That must be great. I mean, it must be a fun time for the three of you to just kind of reminisce over the first experience and then kind of experience rebuilding it with the newest tools. I mean, I'm sure, being able to communicate via Skype and email each other proofs and drafts and throw things into drop boxes is a little bit different than it was back in the 70s.
No kidding. Everything has changed.
Yeah, and everything's going to change next week. It feels like. It feels like the especially in the board game space, the intersection between board games and technology is impacting like every part of their development. And I'm sure that's something that you certainly feel since, I mean, you've been making games for a very long time. It's got to be crazy seeing some of the stuff that people are proposing now.
And not just proposing, but pulling off.
Yeah, it's crazy. I've been running Engage Family Gaming for 5 years, which is, a sneeze worth of time compared to some of the time that like Fantasy Trip and things like that have been like out, right? And even I have started to see, just advances and, just Kickstarter in and of itself is a revolution in the way that games are made.
Yes, it is.
And it's been a neat experience because I actually really, outside of playing some Dungeons and Dragons, which, every nerd kid did growing up in the 80s and 90s, outside of that, I really never got into kind of like the boutique role-playing games. The first one that I got was actually a copy of Munchkin that someone gave me. and which is one of the reasons why I was excited to get an opportunity to talk to you when your PR guy was, asking around, because that was one of my gateways into this world.
All right.
And which it certainly worked, right? I learned a lot about myself as a gamer by playing that game. I think a lot of people learn a lot about themselves as gamers when they play Munchkin, just because it really kind of forces you to really figure out how you're going to overcome other people. But to go from playing a card game with levels and all that stuff into some of the bananas things that get published every day, it's a wild world we live in, huh?
It is.
So let's talk a little bit more, and I know I've been bouncing around a little bit, but my listeners are used to it. I'm crazy. So the game pieces. So they used to be. I'm presuming in the original edition they were the cardboard chits, right?
Correct.
Okay, and so we're gonna stick with that with the new edition.
Yes.
Okay. How much
we're doing large size hexes by popular request, because a lot of people want to play with miniatures as their counters, and that's fine. That was something envisioned even at the beginning.
Okay.
But
that was going to be my question. I was wondering how many people have commented on the Kickstarter asking for you to make miniatures for them.
A lot of people have asked for miniatures, and I'm not saying we'll never do miniatures, but that's not what this project is.
Fair enough. So, Steve, how often, or in the comments of your Kickstarter campaign, have people been beating you up about making miniatures for your game?
Oh, I'd say there have been at least a dozen or two comments going, we wish you would do miniatures. And I'd love to do plastic figure miniatures someday, though what I'd really love to do would be the big ones, 54 millimeter.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
You can get so much detail in a 54.
Sure. I mean, those are almost like action figures at that point. But no, you're absolutely right. That would be really cool. Is that kind of why you moved up to the bigger hexes, or was that just at people's request so they can bring their own stuff?
People's request.
Sure. I mean, it makes sense. I'm glad that you were able to accommodate it. That's got to be a great feeling to be running a campaign and to have, the roadmap penciled in and have someone come in like with a request and being able to grant it without it being like a huge problem. That's got to be a great feeling to be able to just kind of alter the path and make some people happy.
That makes me grateful for Phil Reed, who is managing the print buying on this and who's the one who tells me what we can get away with changing.
Hey, listen, when we got people to help, we got people to help. So with the miniatures, these are punchboard. They're not miniatures. These are punchboard chits that are going to be the different characters on
right.
the map.
Die cut.
And I mean, I see if you look at the campaign, folks, you'll be able to see there's a nice zoomed in, art of what they will look like. How do you choose the art that gets on there? Obviously you have this well-renowned artist who's doing that. Like, how did you come about choosing the different characters? I see like the knight with like a glaive, and is this all returning art, or did you come up with some new stuff?
In execution, it's all new because we had to do all new artwork. I did not get any rights back to the old artwork, so we had to start from scratch on that. In concept, some of it is the same and some of it's new. We just wanted a huge variety of figures that people could play to match, their weapons and,
sure.
and to match themselves if that's what they wanted.
Okay, I dig that. As a LARPer, I super appreciate the amount of flexibility that I see in some of the figures, just either the miniatures that are out there or the art on some of these cards. Being able to kind of match up to what you really envision is hard. So it's cool that there's a lot of flexibility here, and it's not just a dude with a shield and there's 6 copies of him in different colors. I really dig that there's some variety there. So, and obviously there's enemy variety too, because we've got, the bigger, trolls and, ogres and things like that. Should I expect that all of the tropey fantasy monsters are going to be there? The orcs, the ogres, all that stuff? Or what do you think?
The rule book has a pretty good selection
Awesome.
of monsters. Not every monster is represented in the counter set because there are just too many monsters.
True, because people are insanely creative.
Yes. And if we did have a counter for every single kind of monster, you could never find the one you wanted in the stack anyhow.
True.
So, have to balance with reason a little bit. But one of the things that people are asking for is more counters, and it's possible that as a stretch goal, we'll do another counter sheet with some of the bigger monsters.
Sure. I mean, I see. I'm really interested in the shape for the dragon piece, which is, it's really. I mean, I don't want to say interesting too many times, but I have never seen. I've seen a lot of monsters that take up hexes, right? And folks, this is bad video because obviously this is an audio podcast. Go to the Kickstarter page. But the dragon is really interestingly shaped, right? Like it's a straight line of hexes with, like the legs and the front and back legs kind of sticking out. Is that how the design was back in the day? Or
Yes.
Is this a new thing?
No, that's how it was back in the day.
All right. Cool.
The 7-hex dragon. He's a monster.
And how did you...
But in the game, there's also a 14-hex dragon, and people are asking for a counter for that. How do you kill that thing?
I mean, I have fought my share of dragons across the various games that I have played, and usually the answer is not easily.
Yeah.
I never met a dragon that was easy to beat up on, or safe to beat up on. But I mean, you know that you've been making games for a while. We're unlocking stretch goals on this campaign. Let's talk about the campaign and the meat and potatoes of it now, because we've talked about the game. It's a simplified role-playing system. I can't wait to get my hands on it. I will definitely do so at some point. And now it's certainly funded, and we are in the process of, putting together some stretch goals and meeting some of that. All right. So, I think we talked a lot about this super successful campaign so far. I'm excited to see where it goes. And we've still, at the time of this recording, you still got like 25 days to go. So here's hoping that the fantasy trip is a wildly successful Kickstarter. But what I'd like to do, Steve, if I could, is I did get some questions from my community and also from my kids. And I was wondering if you might take a few moments to answer some of those questions.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's start with Carrie from our Engaged Family Gaming community, which you can join, those of you listening, by going to engagedfamilygaming.com/community. She wanted to know where you get all of your fun ideas.
There's a post office box in Connecticut where, no. Let's not go there. Really, it's just a matter of paying attention to popular culture and looking for something that's just screaming to be laughed with.
Sure.
And going from there.
Sure. It's funny that you say that, the laughing with it thing, because obviously, a lot of the games that you make, not all of them, but a lot of them do have a sense of parody built into them, especially like Munchkin, which is ever popular. You've got the new collectible card game that's relatively new. And so, a lot of folks misunderstand parody and assume that it is mockery. And that you're taking stuff and like putting it down and only pointing out its flaws. And correct me if I'm wrong on this, but parody is a form of respect, right? Like you're finding stuff that's cool and saying, hey, that's neat. And this is my funny take on it.
Well, really, when I did the original Munchkin, I was writing about myself. It's a silly game about dungeon crawling,
Sure.
about the kind of role-playing games I like to do. So now here, let's have some fun with it. Let's take all of the tropes and just push them until they break, and then keep pushing.
Sure. Absolutely. Well, that's a great answer, and I agree. I mean, that's something that I noticed about, when I started playing the original Munchkin and all the various games that I, in that series that I have played since, is it really does take a good job of kind of isolating the real, the tropes and, the bits that people take a little too seriously, because at the end of the day, fandom is just people taking things too serious. And, really kind of making light of them in, a fun way, but not a mean way.
If you're mean, you're doing it wrong.
I agree 100%. There's so much room for humor that isn't trolly or rude. I think that's something that if I could figure out one problem with like YouTube culture right now, and watching some of the stuff that my kids watch, is that a lot of the content creators on YouTube that are quote unquote hilarious have forgotten that you can be funny without being crude or rude to people, or mean. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you don't want to teach kids that it's all right to be mean.
Yeah, and you can be funny without it. I mean, that's the one thing, we always watch it, and I come out of it being like, so why was that so funny? Like, because he was just being a jerk. Because nobody thinks jerks are funny. At least I don't. So, next question. This comes from my oldest son. He wants to be a game designer when he gets older. So his
when
question.
He gets old?
I'm sorry?
Okay.
Well,
that's right.
Go
have
ahead.
a long, productive life, and then retire and be a game designer. That's a plan.
All right. Well, I will tell him that. But I think he's going to want to jump the gun a little bit. So
he wants to do it sooner. Okay.
Yeah, these kids these days, they don't have patience. All this internet instant gratification. So if you and beyond that, outside of just him, in my audience, I'm sure there are aspiring game designers. Do you have any advice for someone that is interested in making their first game?
Learn to communicate. Learn to write clearly and briefly, because if you can't communicate your ideas clearly and briefly, it really doesn't matter how clever a game you come up with, you'll never be able to get it across to people.
That is, and beyond that, that's great advice just for everything. But no, you're right. I've never even thought of it that way. Yeah, I mean, the ability to communicate clearly really touches every aspect of game design, because you can't tell your artist what you need if you can't explain it. You can't teach people how to play it. You can't write a rule book. No, I think that is sage wisdom that I think lots of folks could probably do to hear. Anything else, or do we want to settle at the home run?
Well, that's the big one right there, and then the nuts and bolts response to that is playtest your games a lot.
Okay.
Playtest them with different people, because that way you'll find out where you might have failed to communicate, and you'll also find out which of your great ideas isn't quite as great as you thought it was at first.
Have you had any, experiences in the past where you were just convinced that a game was a home run, and you brought it to some folks, and you had to watch it crumble before your very eyes?
It happens with astounding regularity.
That's what's interesting.
You have to try a whole lot of things and see what it is people like.
Sure. What's interesting that you say that. I talk to a lot of game designers, and I think when I think back upon the number of people who I have interviewed, I think the one unifying thing between all of the great, game designers that I have spoken to, is that all the really great ones talked about having projects that they had to just throw out. Whereas the folks that are like, this is my baby and I've been crafting it for years, sometimes that just doesn't cross the finish line. Maybe they should have just thrown it away and tried something else.
Or at least come at it from a different direction. Yeah.
Sure.
If you get too in love with your own work, you lose objectivity.
Sure. That idea of coming at it from a different direction, you gave me that advice not 10 minutes ago. Nobody here heard that. That was some stuff, some production magic, but that is also sound advice. Here's another question. This is from my youngest son. He wants to know if we're going to get more expansions to Zombie Dice, because he loves him some Zombie Dice. He takes it everywhere.
We have 2 expansions to that now.
Yep. The school bus.
I'm not really planning any others.
No. All right. Well, I'll tell him. I'll break his heart, Steve. School
bus and the movies. Yeah. If I come up with a great idea, then everything changes and I'll go after it. But I don't have any new concepts right now for that. And I don't want to go with anything that I don't think has a chance of being a home run.
That makes sense. I mean, it's already a pretty complete package now, and the deluxe edition and like the hard cardboard or the hard plastic tube is just, it's so. I mean, they just got back from Boy Scout camp, and every year the last 2 years, my youngest son has taken Zombie Dice with him, and it's so durable, it's so easy to just throw in his bag, and all we have to do is just make sure he counts 13 dice on the way home.
Right.
Because the last thing we want is to have him brick a board game because he lost some cards or they got stomped in the mud. He dumped all of the Zombie Dice into a mud puddle, and it came back fine. We just had to scrub it a little bit. So I will break his heart and tell him that there's not going to be any more expansions to Zombie Dice. I'll do that for you. But if you come up with any good ideas, he'd be grateful if you get those done. Because he absolutely loves it. So my oldest son wants to know what your favorite game that you have not made is.
Wow, that's a wide field because I like playing games. Let me answer a different question instead.
That is perfectly fine. Sidestepping is okay.
I'm going to pretend that you asked me what I'm playing right now that I really, really like.
I'd love that.
And that's a game called Century from Plan B. And it's an abstract game with beautiful art, and it's a lot of fun.
Which version are you playing? Because I know they have like a couple of different ones. They have the Golem edition, the Old Spice Road.
I've got the Golem edition.
And that one's more obviously more fantasy oriented.
I have not even seen the Spice edition.
Yeah, I've seen it because I was
check it out to see what it looks like.
I was at PAX Unplugged and there were some folks playing the Spice Road edition, and it was, it's beautiful art, but I would say, at the risk of sounding super reductive, obviously it was more like Catan than, say, because, you're building landscapes and, stuff like that. I've never played it. How hard is it to learn? I mean, obviously you have a lot of experience with games.
It is not hard to learn.
Oh, it's not? Okay.
No. The rules are on one sheet of cardboard.
Oh, wow, really?
And they're clearly explained.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, like most games, it's easier to learn if you've got somebody who already knows it teaching you.
Sure.
But, no, it's not hard to learn.
Wow. All right, well, we're going to have to take a look at that. Speaking of Plan B, have you played Azul, their Spiel des Jahres winner?
I have not.
Us either. We're desperate to get our hands on it. Every time we have space to go buy a game, because, as you can imagine, reviewing board games, our dance card is full quite frequently, but every time we have tried to get something to fill in a week or two, it's been out of print.
Wow.
I guess that's a good sign for them.
Yes,
it's a good problem for them to have. So the follow-up question from my older son was he was wondering what your favorite game that you have made is.
Now, that's really hard to answer. That's like if I were to ask you which of your children is your favorite.
I know, but he's 12. He doesn't know better.
That really is the answer. It just depends on what I'm feeling like playing that day.
Fair enough. I mean, you've made a lot of games, so let's change the question a little bit. Well, let's just completely scrap it, because I can appreciate that you've made a lot of different games, so it's not like you really lack for choices among your own products. What's the creative process like for you? Because obviously you're professional, you know this is what you do. What so in a given period of time, like do you have like a specific time of that you dedicate to making games, or are what's your process like?
Well, as far as when, it comes when it comes, and when the fit is on me, I will sit and work for a long period of time, and then go try and find somebody to show it to. But the process always starts with a concept that I want to simulate in some way, and then from there it goes to game mechanics. A lot of designers work the other way around. They come up with a game mechanic that they like, and then they try and find a concept that will fit it. It's like we were talking about Century. That game doesn't have anything to do with either jewels or golems. That's just the skin on it. At its heart, it's a game about building an economic engine. And that's one reason that I could probably never have designed Century in a million years, because I would never have reached a starting point that would let me go to that game. If you told me to design a game about jewels and golems, it would be much more representational.
Sure. Okay. So how many games, and this is a question that's kind of different for everybody that I ask. How many kind of game concepts do you have kicking around at any one time?
Well, if we count the ones that I can't bear to throw away, but I really don't know when I'll do anything about them, doesn't. If we mean how many am I actively working on at a given time, maybe 2.5.
Okay. What's the half?
Something that I'm writing down notes for, but not working on developing the notes.
Okay. No, that makes sense.
Just I'm keeping a file open for it and dropping in more notes. Like, hey, wouldn't it be cool to do a Munchkin set about monkeys? So I just thought of another monkey joke. Put it down.
Fair enough. So does that, constantly capturing? So you're constantly capturing ideas. At the very least, you have like the casual basket to catch things as they fall out. Does that ever lead you to like those moments of panic where you come up with a great idea, but you're not near anything to record it? Because that happens to me on a weekly basis.
No, because I carry a phone with a recording capability, and I also carry a pocket notebook.
Fair enough. So you're smarter than me. I get it. That makes sense. I should probably figure that stuff out. I do have a phone with me at all times. So those are the questions from my community and from my kids. Steve, I want to say I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule, promoting your Kickstarter to talk to me. Your games are some of the reasons why I do what I do. So it's been, an honor to have you on here. Do you have any parting words for my audience about, games in general or really anything? This is your moment.
Oh, stay out of the sun.
Stay out of the sun. Hey, that's probably good.
Nope. Just let's go back to the theme of don't be mean.
Don't be mean. All right. I like it.
Yeah.
Let's put that on a T-shirt, shall we? Man.
Sounds like a win.
I listened to a video yesterday, and there was a line that's kind of stuck out at the end of it that was just stop letting the bad guys win. And it was talking about trolls on the internet and stuff like that. And I think it really kind of resonated with me. It's just like, let's be nice. Let's everybody be good to each other. I think that's a nice thing to do. And meanwhile, let's play some games because, then if you're being mean to somebody playing a game, it's all in good fun.
Get it out of your system and over the game table. Yeah,
absolutely. Let's settle it on the board. So, Steve, thank you very much for coming on Engage, a family gaming podcast. I really do. Again, appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. This has been an honor for me.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Anytime you want to talk about anything, we'll get you on here. We'll make it happen. So, until next time, folks. This is Steve and Steve. We've been talking about board games. Next week, we'll be talking about video games, and this is where my wife and I will have the great debate about Fortnite. So y'all are going to want to be there for that. So, until next time, you have yourself a great week. We'll see you next time, and don't forget to get your family game on. We'll see you next week, folks. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Engage, a family gaming podcast.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week.
Sorry, John. I'm going to clean that up a little bit. I torment my producer, Steve. We're trying to get this podcast up for tomorrow morning. So he's gonna hate me when he gets home from work tonight. But he works for Lego, so he's usually in a good mood.
No kidding.
Yeah, he's in their customer service, so he gets to.
Lego fan.
Yeah. Oh man, did you see that?
It's possible I've even talked to him before. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe. Did you see the new Harry Potter castle they showed off in the last couple days?
Yes. Isn't that something?
Man, listen. I mean, talk about things that have changed a lot. Like, I remember, when like a castle and a sword were weird because, they had weapons. And because, they didn't want to have weapons for the longest time. And now forget weapons and stuff. They got the whole Harry Potter castle. Jeez.
I remember when Lego came in 5 colors. And then when green came out, wow, look at that, another color.
Yeah, right? They, have you seen, I don't know if you watched this is total non sequitur, but whatever. Did you see have you seen the Netflix series, The Toys That Made Us?
No.
They actually did an episode on Legos.
Okay.
And it's really neat, some of the stuff they talk about. And they do other stuff too. They do like the Star Wars toys and Transformers and Barbie, like the big brands, and it talks about their history and their future and like interesting parts. And they interview people who were collectors or who worked at the companies. And the Lego one is super interesting. It goes all the way from the beginning when they were making wooden toys all the way to like now. Super fascinating. It's on your Netflix. So when you're, not promoting a major Kickstarter, it'll be a nice palate cleanser one night. So anyway, but yeah, so he's usually in a good mood when he gets home because he gets to talk about Legos all day. So
be a win.
So maybe he won't beat me up too bad, but we'll figure it out. So